Hi, and welcome to RPR Level 1. RPR stands for Reflexive Performance Reset. In this course, we're going to give you the foundational tool of RPR, which are known as wake-up drills. If you're ready to learn more, press next. I also own a facility, Slow Guy Speed School, where I train a variety of different athletes. And I co-own Reflexive Performance Reset with...
Hi, I'm Cal Dietz. I've been in the coaching business about 25 years, a lot less than Chris. I work at the University of Minnesota. I've been here about 22 years, and I work with a number of college teams. I'm currently only working with Minnesota men's and women's hockey and the U.S. Women's National Olympic Team, and that's pretty much it.
In order to train you like a practitioner, we're going to use this video course like you would be at an in-person clinic. All wake-up drills are part of one of three zones. We're going to start with zone 1, which is the most important. We'll move distally to zone 2 then, and finally we'll get to zone 3. For each of the muscles that we are learning a wake-up drill for, we will start with a brief explanation of the muscle or system that we're looking to change. We'll teach you the test to see if that muscle is working properly or not. We'll then teach you the wake-up drill in order to get that muscle to fire properly. And then we will teach you the retesting to make sure that your wake-up drill was effective. Then after that, we'll take you through a full sequence of going through the entire RPR system using all the wake-up drills. And then finally, we'll show you how to implement this, whether it's a team situation or with an individual. RPR is really simple to use. It's really just a system of tactile contact with your skin to let your body know that it's okay to use that muscle. So I think where this idea that touch comes into play, it's probably been around for thousands of years, but where I think it gets put down in paper in Western medicine is Chapman's reflexes, where he was doing research on organs and different tactile points that may be able to get an organ to function better. And I believe that he found that there's also correlation with muscles as well. And so he outlined that, and people could, that's where basically some of the basics of applied kinesiology come from, are those ideas. But we're just trying to take some of those reflex points and put them all in together into trying to get our body to work properly. RPR was a way to be activated to everyday people and coaches.
We felt like we had to basically scale this in an education process so that we could then take this to coaches who can't work on people, but we can teach them a system of self-care and teach them how to do it in large group settings to get huge benefits of this, right? And the biggest thing people have to realize is someone can work on you and use the system, but if the athlete goes through daily, 5 days a week before workouts or practice and does it to themselves, in a couple weeks that all adds up and they're in a much better spot, right? It's just crazy that people, once we taught them that, the results that we've gotten from teams and coaches to say, hey, our injury prevention's down, hamstring problems, concussions, like this has been a monumental step in our program to help us be successful.
And over time, when you get a bunch of people that are doing it for years, and still there's problems that happen. You still may get a random hamstring pull or some other kind of issue comes up. We had to continually recreate different processes to figure out why, hey, their glutes are on, their psoas is on, how did this happen? And so that's kind of how we unwound it and came up with other things, because we knew there were other things that were popping up even after getting through the level 1 stuff. And that's kind of where level 2 came in, where we're trying to figure out, all right, let's look at these compensation patterns. A compensation pattern is a way that the muscle recruits. That's not always the best way, but it's an appropriate way to get to where you need to go. Where's the hole in what we've been doing before? And that's really what level 2 was in a very basic level. And then level 3 was, all right, now we really need to pinpoint and find those exact spots that are coming off, even though we know the whole system is in balance and recruiting properly. We're looking for the little things that are still coming off to make sure that basically our athletes are bulletproof. And I think that's the key point, is we wanted it to make it so it's not this thing where you have to do it once. The magic of RPR is really you can do it anytime, any place. So there's nothing wrong with doing it multiple times throughout a day. There's nothing wrong with doing it in between races. When I was working with a high school football team, we would do it. Defense comes off the field, they would get in and do a quick reset on themselves in between going on and off the field. So there's no right or wrong time. You can do it anytime. That's really the magic of what RPR is you can reset yourself at any time in any place to put yourself in the best possible neurologic state to perform. Skeptical? So was I. The first time I had someone come over and tried it, I hit the points, the muscle tests work. So then for other muscles, I tried to hit other points that weren't associated with it, and I didn't get the impact that I thought I would. So it kind of showed that there is this tie between these spots and doesn't make the muscle work, which is what's great about RPR. In this level 1 class, we're going to teach you the tests to make sure that you're hitting the right spots and to make sure that it is working. So when you have a group of people, you can bring them up front, you can do one of the tests, you can hit the spots and then retest. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So you've got to have a buy-in. The easiest buy-in that you can have is a rotational test, mostly because you don't have to teach the person up there the reset spot. It's something that I can do. So for the rotational test, I'm going to bring someone up. I'm going to ask them to stand square, and I'm going to hook underneath one arm and push the shoulder with the other arm, and I'm going to rotate them. I'm going to give them a cadence, ready, set, hold, and then I'm going to ask them to try to stop me from twisting them. Ready, set, hold. And if they give, you say, all right, we know that that rotational system is off. Let's reset it with the wake-up drill. So I'll place them, their backs toward me, and I'm going to pound a V into their back. I'm just going to follow along the trap lines. And what we're doing is we're hitting spots that the spine recognizes as spots where the spine will respond and lock down when I apply pressure. So I'll have the person face me again. Again, I'll do the same position. Ready, set, hold, and they're locked in. Someone may say that you're not pushing as hard. Then you can have them come up and test as well. What just happened there? How did we get it to work so fast? Well, what we saw was a reflexive reaction to the input that the brain was receiving and how the body can work. So we can put some kind of tactile cue into the system and the body will reflexively react to get muscles to work properly. The old way of training a muscle would be just to old-fashioned lift weights. The problem with that is it's a very simplistic model, and there's no neural drive to get that to actually function when we're playing our sport or our activity. Now we can have some kind of input into the nervous system to actually get the muscles to fire in the right pattern, so that simple movement of a bicep curl now has neurologic and physical support throughout the system. So when you're working with an athlete or a client, you want to make sure that you establish a baseline of strength to make sure that there's some pattern there where they can actually create strength in their body. If not, we want to make sure that we figure out that there's not something much bigger that's going on that could be, in some cases, very dangerous. Whenever I'm about to test a muscle, I'm going to make sure that they have a cadence so we all know when I'm going to push. I like to go 1, 2, 3, hold, or ready, steady, hold, something that gives them the idea that I'm about to apply pressure onto that limb. The amount of pressure that I'm using is going to be about 10 pounds, which really means I can push with just my fingertips. Way too many times when I see people testing other people, it's a muscle game where they're trying to jam everything down. Sometimes that's fun to show to see how much of a change you've made, but really we're looking for a basic response to a gentle push onto the limb. When I'm going to give the cadence, ready, steady, hold, their job is to not let me move that limb that I'm applying pressure to. I'm looking for a baseline of something where the muscle can work. The positions that we've put the athletes in are positions where only that muscle can work. It's hard to get a compensation pattern in those positions. That's why the positions are where they are. So once we've established that baseline of strength, what we want to do is we want to teach some different hand positions so we can communicate with each other about how to use your hands as tools. The first one is a paint scraper. I just use my thumb, and this is something that you can use to scrub against something that's hard like a bone. Okay, you can get the most pressure that way by using a paint scraper. Another thing that you can use is what I call a hooked hand. So when we're going along the bottoms of muscles or the bottoms or tops of bones, we can use our hooked fingers to go along the top of the bone. Very rarely will we ever push deep into our body, except for our psoas point. You can also use what I call a tiger claw. So when we do something like our shoulders, we can scratch and get a lot more contact in the different places that we may need to access. So when I am scrubbing, I'm going to use about 10 pounds of pressure, which is enough to create some friction in the system. Some people are really sensitive, and we don't want to go that hard. We want to tell them we just want to make enough pressure so there's a change in the system. Some people can be a light tap that can get something to go. Sometimes you're going to have to push pretty hard because they're not responding.
Like in my sport, hockey, for example, they may have a hamstring that's off and had it off for a while. When I say off, it's just not fully functioning at the highest level. But they're in a game and they take a puck in the foot, and now their whole stride changes. Now that hamstring is pulled because they took a puck in the foot.
How we get into that situation are compensation patterns. There is a optimal way for your body to recruit muscles to move forward with hip flexion and hip extension. But as we find other ways, whether it's through injury, smell, light, there's a million different things that can make you change. We start moving away to muscle systems that don't require as much energy, won't give out as much power because neurologically the body feels like there's a danger involved and we want to make sure we don't get hurt. So your body will select other muscles to move. It's kind of like in the Terminator movie when the press comes down and crushes the Terminator, he comes back to life. You see the computer's moving and he finds a new way to move. Our brain does that all the time, constantly monitoring the environment and finding the safest way to move. But the problem is sometimes the safest way to move isn't the most powerful way to move. And so what we can do with RPR is we can put the body into that recruitment pattern that will give us the most power. Because a lot of times the body never comes out of that I'm injured, I'm scared state. It's a safe, comfortable place. So we just need to use these different wake-up drills to actually get the muscles to go. Now, it's kind of interesting about the wake-up drills and how they work. It's really a non-invasive tactile cue to the body to go ahead and use those muscles to work. And if you want to see what that looks like in real life, when you have an infant that's learning to crawl, it doesn't understand English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, or any of those languages. There has to be some kind of tactile cue that tells the body to go ahead and lift their leg up and go into hip flexion to get ready to crawl. So when you watch a baby develop, they're going to be able to pick their head up, which we're going to get to in a second, and they'll rock back and forth. And the part that they're rocking on is right on top of the psoas. So that is a tactile cue to the body to go into hip flexion. When they pick up their head, they're going to push their head back so they can navigate, because that's always one of the top priorities in how the brain works, is the ability to navigate. And it's going to fold right on top of the spot where the skull sits on top of that muscle, which is, again, a tactile cue that it's safe to push, and then you can go into hip extension. We're just trying to tap into those different cues that don't require language, and get the body to work, going back to something that the body recognizes, which is an original touch, an original tactile cue.
And when we talk about compensation patterns, understand you essentially have a problem, whether it could be an injury, and so the body has to reroute how it moves with all the other muscles around it. So those muscles that are now doing extra work, they have greater tension in them. And a lot of times what you'll see, if you have a certain muscle off anywhere in your body, the muscles around it now have to work extra hard. And that's when tendonitis can come up. That's when your movement pattern changes. And it's really just a survival mechanism, because your body's not worried about running a fast 40-meter dash. It's just worried about running fast because it thinks you're running from something, right? So it's survival. So now, with that being said, these patterns can exist. And I started trying to track how the body compensates with one problem. And then I began to realize, and Chris confirmed it, and because he told me he was thinking the same process, that even if somebody has the same injury, everyone compensates, it seems, a little differently, because that's not only the only injury there in the body, right? Everything that goes into these compensation patterns and how your brain develops them is your past injury. It could be falling off a bike when you were a kid that affects you when you're 25 years old, that you broke your arm. And now this might be the reason you're getting tennis elbow when you're training super hard and you're a wrestler, but you broke your arm when you were 7, but your body still compensates for it. And we go in there, we find that, and then we actually break it up with RPR. Well, they actually break it up themselves by doing RPR daily, right? That's the magic, where they start doing the RPR, and all of a sudden they're like, the only thing I touched in this area was my rotator and my delt, but then why'd my tennis elbow go away? And you're going, well, I'm not quite sure, but there was a pattern. We see it.
Yep. You know, easiest way to think of a compensation pattern is you stub your toe. Instantly, your body finds a new way to move.
Yes.
It's going to be very different. And as you get better, you may stay in that pattern because the body said, hey, we're safe here. I don't want to stub my toe again, so I'm just going to stay there, because it doesn't know that you kicked the corner of a table or something like that. And even though the pain may be gone, you may develop a really efficient pattern to use the foot the way you did after you stubbed your toe, and that may become the new you. Now, with RPR, we can go back and say, hey, you're not hurt there anymore. Let's go back to using your foot and the hold chain the way that it's designed to be used.
The original pattern, right?
The original pattern.
Yeah, that's the hope, because that's optimal, but rarely are people optimal.
Right.
Right. And I think we hold on to those patterns. Chris and I believe that there's so much stress in our life. And we're not just talking about driving a car, because that's like 300 times more stressful than walking through the woods. We're talking about you wearing the wrong shoe is stress on your brain. So these patterns might not revert back to the original because of the lights that we're under, right? Because these are very stressful lights for people. You should have natural lighting. I could go through a list of 100 stressors in our life that are just way too much. This is why we hold on to those patterns.
So as Chris talked before about the importance of hip extension and the extension pattern with babies in regards to our development as humans, the other key factor as we get older for hip extension is just basic survival. And what the hip extension pattern is complementing hip flexion. So we can't live without hip flexion or hip extension. And the key to this is that we get the glutes firing correctly. When they're not firing optimally, the glutes, then they recruit other patterns, which we'll get into, and other muscles, such as hamstrings or the lower back or the QL, we call it. And with that being said, this is why people may pull a hamstring when their glutes aren't working correctly. You can see people compensate just by the way they move. And one quick example I'll give you, when I see people walking, and let's say they take an extra long stride when they're walking, that is actually a sign that they're compensating with their hamstring to walk versus using their big glutes to push themselves forward. And we're going to get into deeper compensation patterns here in the next slide. But this is just some key examples and how important hip extension is. So in this slide, we're going to show you the primary neurological pattern that the glutes fire in the sequence for hip extension. So you can see on the butt muscle, the glutes is the number one. So when the glute fires first, the second sequence is that the hamstring below it, the same side hamstring fires. And then the next muscle that fires to drive hip extension and push you forward is the lower back on the opposite side, which is the contralateral QL. And when this sequence is correct, you'll see that people walked more efficiently, they're more effective, they can actually walk more pain-free. And I'll get into why they're pain-free here in one of the next compensation patterns. But the key here is to get your glute to fire first in this sequence of events. This is the key pattern that we're trying to achieve when we do the wake-up drills throughout the body. And when you get this sequence, you'll see that people are highly effective and more efficient when they walk, run, and or move in all forms of hip extension. So one of the hip extension compensation patterns you can see here is it's different from the correct one that we showed you on the previous slide. The hamstring is actually firing first. Then what you have is the lower back contralateral QL fires, and then the glute fires. So you can see how to move the limbs in the body, this is an inefficient pattern because the forces aren't going from the glute outward. They're actually starting from what we call zone 2 and moving inward to zone 1. So this is a reverse compensation pattern flip. So some of the signs of what you'll see is very tight hamstrings, or people pull their hamstrings when they're doing movements. The other thing that you'll see is a posterior tilted pelvis. So the pelvis gets manipulated, okay, because the hamstring has so much tension in it. And then the other thing that you could possibly see is that sometimes people will shorten their gait on one side. And then you can see that their gait changes because they have this compensation pattern. And then in the gait is not always a definitive answer, because people will then, because their hamstring shorter, will actually overcompensate sometimes and try to take bigger strides to compensate and move themselves. So it's quite the dynamic how the body moves and adjusts, but these are just signs that you can see this compensation pattern of hip extension is a problem. So in this slide, you can see this is another hip extension compensation pattern. And then the sequence that happens here, and this is a fairly dangerous one that we consider, is that the QL fires first, the small little back muscle, then the hamstring fires, and then the glutes fire. So again, in the reverse order of what it should be. And some of the problems that we see and signs that you have is you have a tight lower back, especially when you see people, hey, I've been walking all day and my lower back's tight. This is a absolute sign that this is a problem, okay? They have an anterior pelvic tilt, and it is one of the ways that you can see this. You can see that their lower back is, when they walk, they're a little bit more upright because they're trying to fire that little muscle in the back that's made to stabilize. It's this primary hip extension pattern. It's the number one movement when they go to move their hips. So these people quite often have lower backs, which then ties into the 3-finger gap in between the hip and the ribs that you learn about in the course. This can actually close that gap. This firing pattern is definitely a dangerous one, because when all this, the lower back starts to tighten down because you have this compensation pattern, everything gets really tight, your lower back tightens up, and there's a lot of problems that could happen after that. So later in the course, Chris is going to show you testing the hip extension pattern. And what you have sometimes is you'll see people trying to use their entire body, unable to use their glutes very effectively. And you can see them moving their shoulders to try to get their hips to move. And what you have is a hip extension compensation that just doesn't exist. If a person cannot raise their leg without moving the rest of the body, they do not have a neurological based stability to achieve hip extension. This is a safety issue, and we actually take a deep dive into level 2 course about how to really diagnose this and fix it. But the key here is that if somebody goes through the wake up drills and you can't get a response, then this is a very cautious place that you're going to have to be aware of. I would not recommend them to do much strenuous exercise at all, because they are unable to compensate. They're unable to perform the correct pattern. So what you have is somebody that's highly likely to get injured if we don't start doing the wake up drills to get them in a better place. Now, this can happen in a highly stressed state. So do I recommend people when they come in, if they're in a highly stressed state, to do very strenuous exercise? No chance. So this is just something to look for, and is a safety concern, that when people can't get a hip extension pattern without trying to recruit things from all over their body, this is not a safe place for them to be in. And you should start doing the wake up drills immediately, and then keep testing them to see if we can get a response out of them.
Now, the whole idea is that we want to move proximal to distal, which means everything starts from the middle. I mean, if you think about it from a physics standpoint, the more stable the movement is from the middle, everything else will just become more of a whip and have more velocity when you move through. So that's really why we want to stabilize that middle part, that this middle part is what initiates all the movement to move down. So we can have whip-like functions with our arms, whip-like functions with our legs, segmentalizing joints to move together to jump up in the air. And that's really why we're focusing on this zone 1, is that the psoas and the glutes have to be the initiators and stabilizers of movement.
And I personally experimented this when I first learned the system. I would have an athlete come that might be injured, have a lot of things wrong with them, and I just got zone 1 activated and stopped that right there after the psoas, the diaphragm, and the glutes. And they'd walk around, and they would come back a few hours later. Zone 2 and 3 started turning on, if not completely on. So the magic is getting the foundation, and let's call it the core of the body, activated, and then things down the stream actually start to turn on, even though they've been shut off. So, and I think this is a two-way street where something downstream can shut off that shuts off the core, and something in the core can shut off zone 1, can turn off something in zone 3, because it's a linked chain, right? We know about the slings and the kinetic chain. So when zone 1's not working, as Chris talked about, understand people can still be high performers, right? My elite athletes, I literally have elite athletes walk in, and we both have found, hey, he's got a psoas that's not working, but he can still run fast. He's not optimal. The problem is he can run fast, but he's going to break at some point because other muscles are doing too much. So let's say your psoas on your left side is not working. We've seen this stream happen, this chain of events. The quad and the abs now start to do hip flexion. What transpires? You could get a sports hernia. The quad's doing too much extra work. So instead it's doing 2 jobs. So now that person will start to develop knee pain on the left side because their left psoas wasn't doing hip flexion. I've never had an athlete with a weak core and strong hips. So you have to realize that the ab in the midsection sits on your hips. If your hips are working correctly in zone 1, it strengthens the entire core and the entire spine. So any athlete I've ever had with super strong hips, none of them have ever had a weak core. I mean, we're talking women that are 150% stronger than the average male in their core, that we don't do core work. We just make sure their hips are turned on and are strong. And when that's functioning, then the spine can stabilize and everything's going to work optimally. So you get the psoas and the glutes working correctly, everything in the core and up through the rest of the body and down works optimally. And you would be shocked how much better people work.